The small town of Willows Creek had always been a place where nothing out of the ordinary ever seemed to happen. Nestled between rolling hills and tranquil lakes, it was a town where neighbors greeted each other with a smile, where people felt safe to leave their doors unlocked, and where crime was almost unheard of. It was the kind of place that gave the impression of eternal peace, as if the harsh realities of the outside world simply didn't exist within its borders. But that sense of calm was shattered on a chilly autumn evening, when the body of Sarah Bennett was discovered in her home. Sarah had been a resident of Willows Creek for nearly a decade. She was in her early 30s, a kind-hearted woman known for her involvement in the local animal shelter and for helping her elderly neighbors with daily tasks. Sarah lived alone in a modest two-bedroom house at the edge of town, far enough from the bustle of Main Street but close enough to feel connected to the community. On the surface, her life seemed ordinary, nothing that would suggest a dark secret or hidden danger. But when her lifeless body was found, sprawled across the living room floor, it became clear that something sinister had taken place. The police arrived quickly, sealing off the area and beginning their investigation. Sarah's home had been locked up tight, and there were no signs of forced entry. The front door was securely shut, and the windows were intact. It was as if the killer had simply slipped inside undetected, as if they knew exactly how to move through the house without leaving a trace. There was no sign of a struggle, no overturned furniture or broken items that might suggest a violent confrontation. In fact, the only thing out of place was Sarah herself, her body lying unnaturally on the floor, a pool of blood surrounding her head. It was a brutal crime, yet everything about the scene suggested that the murderer had been methodical and precise, leaving no clues behind. Detectives began their search for evidence, but the crime scene provided little to work with. There were no fingerprints, no shoe prints, and no objects left behind that could link anyone to the crime. The victim's phone was missing, and it seemed as if whoever had killed Sarah had taken it with them, perhaps to erase any potential clues. Her belongings appeared untouched, and nothing seemed to be stolen. It was a puzzling mystery, one that left the investigators scratching their heads. As the initial investigation unfolded, the police questioned anyone who might have known Sarah or had been in contact with her in the days leading up to her death. They found that Sarah had been keeping to herself a little more than usual in the weeks before her murder. Her friends mentioned that she had been receiving strange phone calls, but she never disclosed who they were from. Her neighbors also reported seeing a dark figure near her home the evening before the murder, but no one could identify the person. The police began to suspect that Sarah had been targeted, though the motive remained unclear. The investigation turned its focus toward anyone who might have had a connection to Sarah, and that's when a name emerged: Daniel Pierce. Daniel was a local handyman who had worked on Sarah's house a few months earlier. He was a quiet man, someone who tended to keep to himself, but he had become known to Sarah through their casual interactions. Although there was no indication of a romantic relationship, some of Sarah's friends mentioned that Daniel had seemed interested in her. The more the police learned about Daniel, the more they began to wonder if he might be connected to the crime. His alibi for the night of Sarah's murder was shaky, and he was seen acting strangely when questioned. But with no concrete evidence, the police had nothing to charge him with. Still, the investigation continued, and Sarah's death remained an open wound in the heart of Willows Creek, with no answers in sight. Days passed, and the investigation into Sarah Bennett's murder continued to stall. Despite the initial shock that rippled through Willows Creek, life in the town began to return to a sense of normalcy, but there was an unmistakable undercurrent of fear. People locked their doors at night, glanced over their shoulders more often, and avoided walking alone after dark. The peaceful community that had once been untouched by violence now seemed like a place where danger could strike at any moment. The police were doing everything they could, but without any solid leads, the case began to feel like a puzzle with too many missing pieces. As the weeks went by, Detective John Harris, who had been assigned to Sarah's case, began to feel the weight of the pressure mounting. The town was depending on him for answers, and the silence in the investigation was deafening. One morning, he sat at his desk, staring at the file in front of him. There were a few key details, but they were too thin to build a case on. No physical evidence, no solid witness statements, and no clear motive. It was like the killer had left behind nothing but an empty room and a bloody body. Then, in the midst of growing frustration, a break came when the police received an anonymous tip. The caller, who refused to identify themselves, mentioned seeing a man around the time of the murder, a man acting suspiciously near Sarah's house. They described the figure as tall, with dark hair, and noted that he had been hanging around the neighborhood a few days before the murder. It was a vague lead, but it was the only one they had. The description didn't match anyone the police had already questioned, and so Detective Harris immediately ordered that all known residents and visitors to the area on the night of Sarah's death be cross-referenced with the tip. One name popped up more than once during this review: Daniel Pierce. He was the handyman who had worked on Sarah's house a few months prior. Though his alibi for the night of the murder had initially been accepted, he claimed to have been at home watching television alone. Something didn't sit right. Several people in town had mentioned seeing him acting odd during the days leading up to Sarah's death. Some thought he had been watching her more closely than was normal, lingering outside her home, and a few even claimed to have seen him talking to Sarah in a manner that seemed too familiar for someone who only did her repairs. Detective Harris found himself becoming fixated on Daniel. He wasn't sure why, but his gut told him that there was more to this man than what he had initially shared. The more Harris learned about Daniel, the more troubling the picture became. It turned out that Daniel had a history of minor run-ins with the law. Nothing too serious, just a few charges of trespassing and disorderly conduct, mostly stemming from drunken arguments and fights at bars. But still, there was a pattern of volatile behavior. Daniel's nervousness when questioned by police also stood out. His responses were jittery, almost as if he were hiding something. Every time Harris asked about his whereabouts on the night of Sarah's murder, Daniel would give the same answer: "I was home. Alone. Watching TV." It was a story that seemed rehearsed, yet too convenient. There were no neighbors who could confirm his alibi, and the lack of any concrete proof made it difficult to dig deeper. Still, Daniel was not the only suspect. The anonymous tip about the man lurking near Sarah's house the night before the murder kept Harris thinking. Was it possible that Daniel wasn't involved at all, and that he had simply become entangled in a larger, more dangerous scheme? Or was he, in fact, the killer, trying to cover his tracks with a well-rehearsed story? Harris didn't have the answers, but one thing was becoming clear: the case was far from over. And Daniel Pierce, for better or worse, was the key to unraveling the truth. As the investigation continued, Harris knew one thing for sure: the peaceful town of Willows Creek had been forever changed. And if Daniel was the killer, he was playing a much bigger game than anyone had anticipated. But if he wasn't, then the real murderer was still out there, blending in with the very community that had been shattered by Sarah's death. The investigation into Sarah Bennett's murder had become a slow grind, with each new lead offering little more than dead ends or unsubstantiated rumors. Detective John Harris couldn't shake the growing feeling that they were missing something vital. The town of Willows Creek had always been a place where everyone knew everyone, and yet somehow, someone had slipped through the cracks. It was almost as if the killer had orchestrated the murder with precision, carefully covering their tracks and erasing any traces that might have linked them to the crime. But then, a break in the case came from an unexpected source: an anonymous tip. The caller had provided a piece of information that, at first glance, seemed trivial. They claimed to have seen someone resembling Daniel Pierce, the local handyman, at a pawn shop in the neighboring town just a few days after Sarah's murder. The tip was vague and didn't give much detail, but the mention of Daniel was enough to make Harris sit up and take notice. He had already been keeping a close eye on Daniel, but the tip added a layer of suspicion. Why would Daniel, who had already been questioned multiple times, visit a pawn shop so soon after the murder? And what, exactly, had he been trying to sell? If the tip was true, it could be the breakthrough the investigation so desperately needed. Harris quickly put together a team to follow up on the lead. They visited the pawn shop in question, hoping to track down any records or security footage that might reveal more about Daniel's visit. The shop was located in a small, dimly lit building on the outskirts of town. Inside, the walls were lined with shelves full of second-hand electronics, jewelry, and knickknacks. The air smelled faintly of dust and metal, and the shopkeeper, an older man named Harold, was sitting behind the counter, flipping through a magazine. When Harris asked about the tip, Harold seemed confused at first. He didn't remember much about a man named Daniel, but after a bit of prodding, he mentioned that a man had come in a few days after Sarah's death, trying to sell a gold bracelet. The description Harold gave matched Daniel's appearance: tall, with short, dark hair, and a nervous, fidgety demeanor. But there was one detail that made Harris's heart skip a beat. Harold had noticed that the bracelet Daniel was attempting to sell looked very familiar, almost identical to a piece of jewelry Sarah had worn regularly. Harold didn't know where the bracelet had come from, but his suspicion had been enough to make him refuse the sale. Something about Daniel's behavior had set off alarm bells in Harold's mind, so he had turned him away. The fact that Daniel had tried to pawn an item that appeared to belong to the victim raised serious questions. How had he gotten it? Was it possible that Daniel had killed Sarah and taken the bracelet as a trophy, or was there another explanation? With this new information in hand, Harris couldn't afford to waste any time. He immediately ordered a search of Daniel's house, hoping to find the bracelet or any other evidence that might tie him to the crime. The police arrived at Daniel's property later that evening, but when they knocked on his door, they were met with silence. Daniel wasn't home. As they waited for Daniel to return, Harris reviewed the security footage from the pawn shop. The video showed Daniel walking into the shop, holding a small, dark object in his hand. It wasn't clear whether it was the bracelet or something else, but the footage didn't give much away. It was blurry, and Daniel's face was partially obscured by the hood of his jacket. However, the one thing that stood out was the nervousness in his movements. He kept glancing over his shoulder, as if afraid of being seen. The footage only deepened the mystery. Why would Daniel try to pawn the bracelet so soon after Sarah's death? And why hadn't he mentioned it when he was questioned by the police? Had he been trying to dispose of evidence, or was he simply caught in a situation that he couldn't explain? As the search of Daniel's house continued, the tension grew. Harris knew they were on the edge of discovering something significant, something that could change the entire course of the investigation. But as time ticked by, one question remained unanswered. Was Daniel Pierce the killer, or was he merely an unfortunate bystander caught in the web of a crime he didn't commit? Harris was no closer to the truth, but one thing was certain: Daniel's connection to the case was more than just coincidence. The tension in Willows Creek had reached a boiling point, and Detective John Harris was feeling the pressure of the investigation like never before. Every time he thought he was on the verge of uncovering the truth, the case would slip through his fingers, only to present a new, unexpected twist. With the tip about Daniel Pierce attempting to pawn the bracelet, things had seemed to fall into place, almost too perfectly. But there was something nagging at Harris, an unsettling feeling that perhaps Daniel was not the killer, but a pawn in a much larger, more sinister game. The search of Daniel's house had yielded nothing significant. No jewelry, no weapons, no traces of Sarah's belongings, nothing that would directly connect him to the crime. The police had scoured every corner of his property, hoping for a piece of evidence, a small clue that might turn the tide. But it felt like they were chasing shadows. Daniel had returned home the following day, looking disheveled and defensive, but without any concrete evidence. They had no choice but to let him go, at least for the time being. The case seemed to be at a standstill, until a few days later when Detective Harris received a call that would change everything. It came from the surveillance team who had been monitoring the area around Daniel's house. They had been instructed to keep a watchful eye, just in case Daniel made any unexpected moves. What they discovered was a twist that no one had anticipated, a piece of surveillance footage that was far more telling than anything they had seen before. The footage came from a camera positioned on a nearby street, one that had been set up by the police to monitor Daniel's property. At first, the footage had seemed like nothing special, just a normal night with no sign of any unusual activity. But as the detectives watched it frame by frame, something caught their eye. In the background of the footage, a figure moved quickly across Daniel's backyard, near the area where the garden shed was located. The timestamp on the footage indicated that the figure was there at the exact time that Sarah's murder had occurred. It wasn't Daniel. The figure was taller, more agile, and it was wearing dark clothing, almost blending into the shadows of the night. Harris watched the footage over and over again, his pulse quickening as the mystery deepened. The figure in the footage was wearing gloves and a mask, making it impossible to identify. The presence of this unknown person at the exact time of Sarah's death was undeniable, but what was even more unsettling was the realization that this person had been on Daniel's property, right under the detectives' noses, without them ever noticing. The discovery sent shockwaves through the investigation. The killer had been there, hiding in plain sight, and Daniel had no idea. This raised a terrifying new question. Was Daniel Pierce involved in Sarah's death at all, or had he been unwittingly connected to a much more dangerous criminal? Had he been playing a role in a plot that he didn't understand? The more Harris thought about it, the more the pieces began to fit together in a way that made his skin crawl. The figure in the footage had moved with a sense of purpose, and the way they darted in and out of the shadows made it clear that they knew exactly what they were doing. The killer had planned everything with careful precision, knowing that the surveillance cameras would capture nothing more than a blurry image. The footage had revealed a hidden truth. Daniel, for all his odd behavior, had been nothing more than a pawn in a much larger, well-orchestrated scheme. As the footage was enhanced and analyzed by the police, they began to piece together more details about the figure. They examined the clothing, the way the person moved, and even the shadows cast by the camera to determine the height and build of the individual. With every minute of footage analyzed, it became clearer that the killer was someone who had been living in the area, someone who could easily slip into the background and remain unnoticed. But who were they? And why had they chosen to hide in the shadows, leaving Daniel to take the fall? The discovery was the breakthrough the investigation had been desperately waiting for. Harris knew that the key to solving the case lay in identifying this mysterious figure and understanding their connection to Sarah and Daniel. But time was running out, and the killer was still out there, watching, waiting. The stakes had just gotten much higher, and the game was far from over. As the investigation progressed, the revelation from the surveillance footage turned the entire case on its head. Detective John Harris had spent weeks narrowing down his suspects, focusing primarily on Daniel Pierce, but the discovery of the mysterious figure in the footage made him realize that the real killer was someone else entirely. The person in the video, a shadowy figure who had been on Daniel's property at the time of Sarah Bennett's murder, had been the one responsible for her death. And Daniel, for all his suspicious behavior, had merely been caught in the crossfire of a far more complex and sinister plot. The enhanced footage was nothing short of a breakthrough. It gave Harris a glimpse of the killer's height and build, though it still wasn't enough to identify them conclusively. The police were able to see that the figure had been wearing dark clothing and a mask, which made it impossible to discern any facial features. However, there was one detail that stood out. The killer had moved with a strange, almost calculated precision, suggesting that they were no stranger to such activities. The way they slipped in and out of the shadows, avoiding detection, was an unsettling indication of someone who was either highly trained or incredibly familiar with the area. Despite the absence of a clear identity, the footage sparked new theories among the detectives. They began to dig into local records, searching for anyone who might have had the skills to commit such a crime. It didn't take long for them to uncover the name of a man who had slipped under the radar: Ethan Cole, a former convict who had been recently released from prison after serving time for a string of violent crimes. Ethan had been living in Willows Creek for only a few months, using a fake identity to blend in with the local population. His criminal record included armed robbery and assault, but what stood out to the detectives was a much darker detail. He had been involved in multiple violent crimes during his time in prison, including several incidents that suggested he had a particular fondness for manipulating and controlling others. When Harris dug deeper into Ethan's history, he discovered that the man had been living in the town under the guise of a new life. He had found work as a laborer, keeping to himself and never drawing attention to his past. It became clear that Ethan had been hiding in plain sight, and his ability to remain undetected for so long was a testament to his manipulative nature. But why had he chosen Sarah Bennett as his victim? What had made her the target? The more they uncovered, the more chilling the connection became. It turned out that Sarah had unknowingly witnessed one of Ethan's earlier crimes. She had seen him during a burglary at a neighboring home and had recognized him, though she hadn't initially realized who he was. Ethan, realizing she had become a liability, had decided to eliminate her. Her murder had been cold and calculated, executed with the same level of precision that the detectives had seen in the footage. Harris and his team began to connect the dots. Ethan had used Daniel Pierce as an unwitting pawn in his plan. The strange behavior Daniel had exhibited, his nervousness when questioned, his attempt to pawn the bracelet, had all been part of a larger ruse. Ethan had manipulated him, drawing him into the crime without Daniel ever realizing what was truly at stake. The breakthrough came when they found a series of phone records that connected Ethan to Sarah's home. It was clear that he had been watching her, learning her routine, and planning the murder down to the smallest detail. He had orchestrated the crime with terrifying precision, knowing that the police would focus on Daniel, whom he had carefully framed as the prime suspect. It was a masterful diversion, one that could have worked if not for the secret footage that had exposed him. When the police finally tracked Ethan down, he didn't resist. His arrest was almost anticlimactic, as if he had expected it all along. As they read him his rights, Ethan showed no remorse, only a chilling indifference to the lives he had destroyed. He had thought he could get away with it, believing that the town of Willows Creek would be too quiet, too unaware to notice him lurking in the shadows. The capture of Ethan Cole brought a sense of closure to the people of Willows Creek, but it also left them shaken. The killer had been living among them, undetected for months, and it had taken one piece of secret footage to unravel his entire plan. It was a sobering reminder that evil could hide in the most unsuspecting places. Sarah Bennett's death had been senseless, but her murder had also uncovered a dark truth, that sometimes the real criminals are the ones you never see coming. And in the end, it was the overlooked hidden details that brought the killer to justice.